Hi, I'm Tyrrell of Uncommon Knowledge and welcome to PTSD and Depression. Is trauma locking your client's depression in place? And why lifting a traumatic memory can bring rapid progress. Now, a client of mine, Samantha, or Sam, was deeply depressed when she came to see me. And I asked her why she thought she'd become depressed. And she said, well, I don't really know why I became depressed, but it started about 3 months ago. And it doesn't seem to make any sense to me because I have everything to live for in life. You know, I have a wonderful boyfriend, she said, a great job, wonderful friends, but I've started feeling really afraid. In fact, more than just afraid, I've started to feel terrified. And she told me that she'd been signed off work with stress and that she'd stopped going out to see friends and so forth. And she just wanted to stay at home all the time with the doors locked. And she said, you know, it seems like I can't escape these feelings. I'm starting to feel as though I've nothing to live for. And that's just not me, really. That's just not true because I have so much in my life. And she was pretty tearful at the beginning of the session. So I asked Sam, I said, how long have you been feeling depressed? And she thought about that and she said, well, it's been about 3 months now. And that was curious to me. So I said, you know, did anything happen around 3 months ago? Anything that was out of the ordinary for you? And Sam's brow sort of furrowed with the effort of thinking back across some miserable weeks, you know, since 3 months before. And she said, well, you know, now that I think about it, I was involved in a really minor car accident around 3 months ago. It wasn't even an accident. I just pranged the car slightly. But it really wasn't anything serious. I just dented the car in a parking lot and it was a silly thing to do and it wasn't a major thing. But it was after that that you started to feel anxious and then depressed, I asked her. And she said, yes, actually it was, now that I think of it. So I thought, well, that's curious. Why should a small prang in a car that got sorted out immediately cause depression? So I said, and have you ever been in any other kind of car crash before that minor incident in the parking lot 3 months ago? And a kind of shadow crossed her face as I put that question. And she suddenly looked weighed down by some invisible burden. She said, yes. She said, I was in another car crash. And she said, 10 years ago, I was badly burned in a car crash, mainly my legs. And I was trapped in the car. And eventually I lost consciousness, but I still remember that time. But the driver of the car, my boyfriend, was killed in that crash. And she paused and then said in a small voice, but that was so long ago. So I asked Sam, I said, Sam, this little collision you had a few months back, how did it affect you? And she said, well, you know, I was surprised at my own reaction to it because although it was just a small dent in the car, I found myself crying uncontrollably afterwards and felt really badly shaken up, even though nothing serious had happened. And then I started having nightmares about that time from 10 years ago again, after my boyfriend died. So we talked about this a little bit more, and Sam agreed that it was possible that the very minor collision that she'd had in her car 3 months before may have reactivated traumatic feelings from around the decade-old trauma of when her boyfriend had been killed in the car. So I decided to go for the trauma litmus test, if you like. So I said, Sam, you know, when you recall that crash from 10 years ago now, before you lost consciousness, does it make you feel very frightened in the here and now to recall that time? And just do that for a few seconds. Just recall that old crash. And as she did that, she turned a little bit pale and began to tremble. So I quickly encouraged her to refocus her attention on me and to come out of that memory, the sort of trance state of the memory, and back into reality with me, because I'm not in the business of making my clients feel anxious. And then Sam told me that the memory felt very raw to her and also very recent. And we find this with traumatized people, that memories, traumatic memories, don't fade through time the way normal memories do. So 30-year-old traumatic memory could feel like it happened last week. Okay. And she said, yes, it feels very, very recent and very raw. So we knew that it was still processed through the fight or flight part of her brain, the amygdala, whenever it was recalled. So it seemed to me there was no other reason why Sam had become depressed. She didn't have a history of depression before the car crash. So her emotional and physical needs were being met in her life. She'd not been particularly worried about anything before 3 months ago. And her life seemed fine, but it started to fall apart 3 months ago. So for around 75% of people who experience a trauma, the effects will naturally fade in time. They'll talk it through, they'll get support. After a couple of months, it won't be there really. But for the remaining 25%, there'll be an enduring effect from the trauma, which is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, and depression can be linked to that. So here are 3 reasons why unresolved trauma may tip someone into clinical depression. So number 1, high stress levels. So depression rides off the back of anxiety and stress. All depressed people are pumped full of the stress hormone cortisol that eventually causes them to become exhausted and feel flat, hopeless and powerless. Without heightened stress levels in the body, there can't really be depression. So depression is a stress condition. Okay, it's not just a stress condition, but it is a stress condition. Sustained or chronic stress leads to elevated levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, reduced levels of dopamine activation, the reward pathways in the brain, an inability to engage in activities which give us joy or what we need. So things like sex drive may drop away, appetite, sleep quality will change, and also the ability to express normal moods and emotions may be impacted, all through the mechanism of stress in the mind and body. So when the stress response fails to shut off and reset after a difficult situation has passed, it can lead to depression in susceptible people. So all depression treatment needs to include relaxation training of some sort, whether it's mindfulness or clinical hypnosis. But feeling traumatized also results in another phenomenon that's often a key factor in the development and maintenance of depression, which is feeling helpless. So people can survive any deprivation, any stress, if they feel they have some control over it, if they feel it can be surmounted. It's when people feel helpless that they feel hopeless. So we all need to feel we have some control over at least some parts of our lives. So feeling that we have no control and are powerless and helpless is hugely depressing. Learned helplessness, feeling helpless when you're not, because you were helpless back in the day, back in the past, is a major feature of many depressions. So we were over-applying the feeling of helplessness to areas of life where it doesn't apply, where actually we could make changes. So this kind of learning or mislearning makes people more susceptible to depression and learned helplessness, because depression is also a condition of lack and loss of hope. So we may have to specifically treat the learned helplessness. And we can sometimes do that by lifting a trauma. So when people are traumatized, their emotions also feel totally out of control. So for all those years following that tragic crash, Sam would have felt emotionally vulnerable as different elements of her life pattern matched to the original trauma and made her feel like she was back in that trauma again. She hadn't spotted this pattern consciously, but the unresolved trauma made her more susceptible to depression, and something which even just faintly reminded her of that tragic incident 10 years ago bordered on depression. Number 3, we can look at unfulfilled needs. So human beings depress when 1, their innate human needs remain unmet over a long period of time. But more crucially, 2, they then start to ruminate negatively and without hope about those needs ever being met, thus racking up their stress levels even higher. If this situation continues long enough, people become emotionally and physically exhausted. So we all have needs to feel safe and secure day to day. So we have a need for a sense of safety. We have a need to give and receive attention to and from other people. We have a sense of some control and influence over events in our lives. We have a need to feel a sense of control, a need to feel stretched and stimulated by life to avoid boredom and provide meaning. We need to have fun sometimes and feel life is enjoyable. We need to feel intimate with at least one other human being who we can feel unconditionally accepted by. We need to feel connected to and part of a wider community. We need to have some privacy as well and time to privately reflect. We need to have a sense of status, a recognizable and appreciated role in life to help us develop self-esteem. And we need to have a sense of competence and achievement, and above all feel that life has purpose and meaning for us. Continuing to be traumatized long after a distressing event makes us feel powerless and avoidant. So we might start to avoid things that might actually help us meet our innate needs, such as company or intimacy or fun. So that's how trauma can block the completion of those vital emotional needs and both cause and then maintain depression as a person starts to reflect on their unmet needs and over ruminate and worry. But of course, it's not always about trauma. Depression is not always about trauma. People depress for all kinds of reasons, and we should never assume that unresolved trauma must be a cause. You know, we can't go off looking for traumas and assume that all depression are caused by traumas that just aren't there. You know, looking for traumas that aren't there can be quite toxic for depressed people whose depression may have a completely other cause. But trauma is sometimes a major factor in depression, which is why knowing how to correctly identify trauma and knowing how to relieve it fast are vital skills for any practitioner. By the end of Sam's session, after using the rewind technique, she was able to think about the crash from 10 years before whilst feeling quite calm. And she said to me, "Of course, I'm sad about that, about what happened, but I'm so glad to finally feel like it's properly in the past now, and now it feels like 10 years ago and not 10 hours ago." And Sam's depression lifted almost as fast as it had begun, as the heightened stress caused by the reactivation of the previously unresolved trauma was no longer there to maintain the depression. And she started going out again and went back to work a few days later, and she started to feel safe at last and started having the life that she should have had all along. So I hope you found that useful, and if you did, please hit like and subscribe. And if you want to hear when my next video is published, hit the notification bell below. I'm Mark Tyrrell of Uncommon Knowledge, and if you'd like to subscribe to my email newsletter, you can find it over at unk.com/blog. That's unk.com/blog. And thanks for watching.